cochlear implant, bionic ear, and that, you know, they are eons ahead of their time. They can't, I mean, they've tried to use the same technology to replace artificial eyes and stuff like that, where they have electrode arrays separated by silicon, but they can't manufacture that fine enough to go in the retina. It's just not going to work, right? So there are other electrode type of arrays that will go into the retina, and they've got functional ones that are now up to 1,000 electrodes that will implant into your retina, so you get a visual field of about 1 in 1,000, a resolution of 1,000. You'll probably hear about those shortly. And the highest one is active implanted medical devices, and this is a pacemaker. This pacemaker here would, I don't know what one that is, but they usually have the name and everything etched on them so that it can't, you know, it doesn't matter how long it's been in someone, you will still be able to determine what it is. That's for a just straight pacemaker, not an implanted defibrillator. Which needs a battery to defibrillate you. This one's probably 10 years old, and the ones now would probably have this much cut off. They'd be about the size of 2 20-cent pieces. They'll go for 10 years, so if you've got battery technology that stimulates your heart for 10 years inside you, along with all the computing and everything and all the radio receiving stuff that you need to program it, you know, there's a lot to these little fellas to keep them going for 10 years. You know, there's not much that you can switch on and it goes for 10 years, let alone keeps you alive for 10 years, all right? So you can see why it's such high risk. And they usually implant them under the chest, and this is the thing, so they're totally implanted. And then if you want to communicate with the device, you need an RF coil that's specially tuned, and they're very sophisticated programmers to program them and change all sorts of characteristics in the pacemaker to make it do what you want. And the characteristics of the electrode that's implanted into your ventricles or your atrium or whatever, or both, depending on what type of pacemaker it is, the impedance and resistance between those electrodes and your tissues and stuff changes over time as well. So you normally, if you've got a pacemaker, you need to go in probably every 6 months. Some people maybe don't go quite so often, even if everything's going all right, and they analyse the output of the pacemaker and tune it all up, okay? All right. So we all know about medical device regulation in Australia and where we're all up to, don't we? So what you guys need to know before you start a project in Australia. To get a device put on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods in Australia, you have to be an Australian manufacturer, or be a European manufacturer. There are 2 things that you have to demonstrate. One is you have to demonstrate compliance with what is known as the essential principles. And again, you can download these off the TGA website. That's not nearly as scary a document to read, okay? And in there are 12 sort of technical essential principles that you're supposed to comply with, and I'll describe these shortly. There's a 13th one that's called clinical evidence. So if you go out and do clinical trials to prove that the device works and it's safe, prior to 2007, all you had to do was prove that the device was safe. So you could say, I've built this device that makes you live to 1,000 years if I implant it in you, and you could sell that as a medical device, provided it didn't hurt you, okay? Didn't matter if it didn't make you live to 1,000 years, give or take a few. As long as you could prove that it was safe, you could still sell it as a medical device. 2007, they started to bring their emphasis back into clinical evidence. So if you had an advertising claim or a therapeutic claim that it kept you alive for 1,000 years, you had to do long-term trials to prove that it did. I think they're still ongoing, those trials. And the other thing you need to show is you need to show that you've got good manufacturing practice, okay? And you need to have what's known as quality systems, okay? So everybody's seen the 5 tick mark, ISO 9001 quality system. You're all good engineers, you know about that, don't you? Well, you better. All right. So the ISO 9001 is about 80% of the quality system you need to manufacture medical devices, and if you want to be an engineer anywhere, you need to know about that in anything, whether it's civil, environmental, aeronautical, or whatever. Then they have another one called ISO 13485, and that's the quality manufacturing system that applies to medical devices. It's a bit more onerous than the general ISO 9001 quality system. We have a little problem in Australia at the moment that the only people that can audit you to ISO 13485 and certify that you comply with that is the Therapeutic Goods Administration. Or they'll only accept, no, there's other people that can do it, but they're the only guys that will accept their own certification. That's a bit of it's not a very good way to be, because there's sort of judge, jury and executioner, and there's a lot of complaints from industry that they need to have independent quality system certifiers, because the TGA is the regulator, not the certifier of how good you are, okay? So if someone else says you're good, then the TGA should accept that, okay? And that's how it is in the rest of the world. In Europe, they have independent certifiers, and then they have the government regulator that looks at all the evidence, says, yeah, they tick all the boxes. They're not the guy, they've ticked all the boxes, we'll accept that. They're not the guys that tick the boxes and then say they can use the device as well, which is basically where we are with the TGA. And that's a problem. Everybody knows it. But the TGA, because it gives them ultimate power in the market in Australia to make or break manufacturers, trying to get power off anybody's difficult, and they're being very devious and slippery about trying to separate those two things. And I think it'll basically come down to a parliamentary directive that they must. Okay. So I talked about the essential principles, and I was going to put them all down here, but I thought I'll just go through them quickly one at a time. Remembering that the first 12 comply to medical devices, the 13th clinical evidence, and the 14th only a new one that's only again come out last year, 2010, where they decided that they needed to regulate in vitro diagnostic devices. So who knows what an in vitro diagnostic device, who knows what in vitro means? Yeah, well, in vitro means that's right, outside the body, but in vitro in Latin means in glass, so it's in a test tube. So when you do all the biochemistry testing or whatever testing you do where it's outside the body, that's in vitro diagnostics. That hasn't been particularly well regulated up until 2010. So they're starting to bring it in. There's huge money in pathology machines. Unbelievable, all right? So if I go through the essential principles quickly, and some of these slides are a bit longer than others, and I'm not going to dwell on them, so you get the idea. So the first one goes all the way back to Hippocrates in the Grecian days, and the first essential principle is that the use of medical devices shall not compromise health and safety. So it's back to that old thing, first do no harm, okay? And this is an excerpt from what they say in this summary of the essential devices. I won't go through that, that's pretty self-evident. Okay, design and construction. The second principle is design and construction of medical devices to conform with safety principles. So the reason I'm telling you this, I can see I'm clearing the decks, because I knew it's exciting stuff. No, that's all right, but that's fine. But if you do go on and to be researcher and develop or work for a company, and you'll be able to recite this stuff in your dreams. Okay, all right. And if you're not aware of it and you get to the end of a project, then you're really in trouble when you try to go back and prove all of this. Oh, I designed and constructed my medical device to design But I mean, we did it on a piece of paper over a beer down at the Rose in Chippendale, you know. I've seen that done, eh? You know, and but you don't want to say that. You know, you've got to go back and say we had design control meetings where we kept minutes and we all signed off and we did all this and we did all that. That's what the TJ want to say. So it's much easier to know that and start doing that stuff at the beginning of a project, or at least being aware of that and knowing that you're going to have to come up with it, than trying to find it all at the end. It's a bit like doing your tax. You know, if you don't keep all your receipts, when tax return time comes, it's a bun fight. If you've been sort of fastidious, you might and know that, at least if you know you've got to keep your receipts and expenses, you're a lot better off than getting to the end and going, well, gee, I didn't even know I had to keep my receipts and expenses. So same sort of principle here, okay? And on this one, the first thing you've got to do is identify hazards and risks associated with the use of the device. So, you know, you've got to eliminate or reduce those risks. You've got to ensure that protection measures are taken and alarms and things to reduce risks that can't be eliminated. You've got to inform users of any residual risks that are left. I've got a great photo here actually, which I wish I'd included. I went and I work in Burma a lot, and I was over there and they'd written something in Burmese on this ventilator in big red texture, and I went, oh, what's that mean? Does that mean, you know, danger? I was trying to work out my Burmese writing, and they went, no, it means this ventilator's killed someone, be careful. It wasn't like, don't use it. And then you've got, you know. So if you want to, this one here, there's an international standard, ISO 14971, the medical devices, application of risk management to medical devices. The original risk management standards were actually Australian standards, 4760 I think is the original, first standard entitled risk management, AS 4760, and then all the other risk management standards in the world have flown and developed out of that, including this one. Okay, so, you know, that talks about all the risks and risk eliminations and things and how to do that. So that's the standard. So to comply with this essential principle, the easiest way to say that to the Therapeutic Goods Administration when you're assessing your thing, your new device, is how to, I comply with essential element 2, design and construction of medical devices to conform with safety principles, because someone's audited it and shown that I've complied with this standard. If you can show compliance with a standard, then effectively you address that essential element, okay? You all right? Okay, so medical devices, the third essential element is that medical devices must be suitable for intended purpose. Okay? And don't get me wrong, that, you know, if you build a splint that breaks because you put too much weight on it, then it's no good as a splint, so don't try and sell it as a splint, you know? You've got to demonstrate long-term safety. So, you know, how do you know an X-ray machine's going to be safe in 10 years, sort of thing? How do you know a patient monitor's still going to be accurate in 10 years? How do you know the little pacemaker I put into you hasn't corroded into a seething mass of corrupt, you know, in 10 years? How do you know that the materials aren't a problem? There's a simple one, essential element 5, medical devices not to be adversely affected by transport or storage. This is particularly pertinent to stuff that's got to be kept sterile, okay, because humidity, temperature, moisture, pressure changes can compromise sterile packaging. But, you know, plastics go off, everything has a life, metals corrode. Well, that's a long-term one, but, you know, vibration destroys stuff. Do you know the biggest, the worst thing to put, if you want to destroy something, what's the worst way to transport it? What gets the biggest shocks? rail. If you want to put something on a train and it's being shunted around, they can hit up to 20 Gs in a train, right, when they're having a cranky night shunting. You're lucky to get over 2 Gs in an aircraft, right? Okay. So everybody thinks, oh, we'll put it in a big crate and we won't. The trucks will go to about 10 G, big rough roads. So they think that, we'll put it on the train because that's a good way to go, and it gets shunted one night and they get it out the next day and it doesn't work. That's why. So the benefits of medical devices, essential element 6, must outweigh any undesirable effects. So I haven't got an example of that, but I'm sure there's a few. Radiotherapy would be a good one. I mean, what gives you cancer? Radiation. So what do they do when you get cancer? They irradiate you. Because, because it kills the cancer, doesn't it? So, that's a bit of a catch-22 one. So I'm a bit cynical there. But you've got to show that all the chemical, physical and biological properties are all good. So you've got to look at the materials you build it. That's the biocompatibility. You've got to look at contaminants and residues. When you're plastic moulding, there's a lot of stuff, release agents and stuff that can stay on the surface that aren't particularly biocompatible. You've got to show that it's safe with other material. One of the big problems with metal implants originally was they were never quite made out of the same type of steel, so you got galvanic action if you put them too close to each other. If you incorporate stuff into it like biologicals for slow release, you've got to show that, and that's sort of like drug-eluting stents and the stuff they put on the outside of stents to stop you getting thrombus. You've got to show that that's all good. You've got to show that stuff doesn't leach out of it, plasticizers and stuff like that. At the moment, I've got a very good example of this one going on where we've got 2 MRI suites in the Children's Hospital, and we went out and bought my anaesthetists MRI-compatible anaesthetic machines because they argued that they wanted to be inside the MRI so they could touch the patient and everybody like that. So at vast expense, we went and bought them MRI-compatible anaesthetic machines. After they'd sat inside the MRI, and if anybody's ever been in one, it's quite an eerie experience because it makes funny noises, and it's like being in an anechoic chamber with going squeak, 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 and it's funny lighting, and it's, they decided they really didn't like being in there. So what they did was they went away and they pulled the anaesthetic machine out, and to cut a long story short, they went to the hardware shop and they got big long PVC hose tube, like conduit for putting an electrical wire in, the grey stuff, and they sat outside and they used that because it was stiff and had low friction to gas flow to ventilate the patient inside the room, but they're running all these anaesthetic solvents through this circuit, right? So I said to them, have you ever thought about the biocompatibility of your PVC tube with the anaesthetic agent? I've stopped them doing it right now. And they went, well, we didn't think of that. How are we going to test that? So I said, well, just cut a little bit of the grey tube off and drop it in a bit of anaesthetic agent and see what happens. So they did that once and they came back to me and they stopped doing it, right? I went, oh, no, it dissolved the plastic. So what was happening was that anaesthetic agent was dissolving into the plastic, which effectively meant that the plastic would then be releasing anaesthetic agent into the circuit, which effectively meant that these anaesthetists had no control over how much anaesthetic agent the patient was getting. Naughty. So that's what you get with doctors, right? Little knowledge is a dangerous thing. They think they're doing a great thing. We're really smart doctors. We've redesigned anaesthetic machines. We've gone to Bunnings and done it. Why do we need all this stuff, right? I get it a fair bit. Okay, so infection and microbial contamination. You've got to try and minimise all of that. We all know about mad cow disease or Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease and all of that, and that's why a lot of things have become single-use devices or single-patient-use devices, because they can't decontaminate unless they heat that up to about 400 degrees centigrade, which basically anneals all metals and stops all surgical instruments from being sharp and makes them bend and destroys most plastics. So if you're using stuff in the nervous system, then CJD, a lot of it's now become single use. Now, if you're a manufacturer, that's like a bonus, isn't it? Because it's like, having a new pen that every time once you've used the pen, you've got to throw it out and get a new one, So they sell lots more stuff. So it's sort of played into the manufacturer's hands. Part of the reason why we spend so much money on medical devices in New South Wales compared to drugs, when the rest of the world's the same. They're becoming pretty, I gave the example of catgut before. That is still the preferred suture for many, many applications, okay? And animal product, sort of flavour of the month, they were going to use kangaroo tail tendons and treat them and implant them into humans. And so I spent time when I was at New South Wales University working with kangaroo tail tendons and working out tensile strength of all of those, which was interesting, trying to work out how to do tensile strength of a tendon and then all different ways that we could treat it so we could use it as a xenograft. A xenograft's when it comes from another animal and they put it into you. But in the end of the day, we gave up on that because a bit like the catgut, how we treated it and processed it to make it consistent and conform with all the essential principles was just beyond us. There's stuff like sterility, okay, so I talked about CJD disease. And you can have non-sterile stuff. Do people know the difference between sterilising something and decontaminating something? Okay, so when you, if I want to stick something inside you, I can decontaminate it. Now, decontaminating it means I kill all the nasty bugs on it, but it's still got little bits of those nasty bugs and things on the outside. They're called pyrogens, so because they induce an inflammatory reaction and cause your temperature to increase. So I can decontaminate something. They do this a lot in respiratory stuff where they don't really care if you get pyrogens because we're breathing pyrogens all day long, but they don't want you to get any nasty bug stuff down you. So they'll decontaminate rather than sterilise. Sterilise means as they go the next step where they remove all the pyrogens as well. Okay? And you also need clear information as to sterility status because a lot of stuff is supplied, and this goes all the way from hip implants to pacemakers, and it comes in a little box and a little package. And when it comes, you don't know if it's sterile or not. You might have to sterilise it yourself in the hospital, okay? And if you don't have that information, you could put something that basically everybody had handled and then put it into someone's hip, and they could get some nasty infection and lose their hip and be in a lot of trouble. So there's a lot to sterility and decontamination and all of that, and it's way beyond the scope of this talk to give to. The construction and environmental properties, so most devices may be used with other devices. So if I've got a ventilator and that's measuring your thoracic volume by using Alistair's newfound impedance technique, which they're starting to release now commercially, and then that's interfering with your normal ECG machine, then that's a problem. So we do have that problem. That's a real problem because how we measure respiratory rate in a patient now is, I think it's about a 32 megahertz AC wave that we pass across, I might be wrong on that, across your chest, and then the changes in impedance as you breathe in and out tell you how fast the person's breathing. The problem with that is that's also the same frequency as pacemakers use. So if I put a normal respiratory signal measurement technique that you'd find in Prince Alfred Hospital in the ED department onto a patient with pacemaker, it can cause the pacemaker to go AWOL, right? That's current problem. We still have that. So all respiratory, well, I mean, all staff who work in EDs and in intensive cares know that. So they'll switch the respiratory measurement off when they've got a patient with a pacemaker, or they should know that. It always comes up every 5 years. Something, oh, I thought you knew that. You've got to minimise all the other things, which is normal, like fire risk. You don't want the thing overheating and catching on fire. You want it to be easy to maintain, you know, so if you pull it apart, it doesn't fall into 1,000 pieces on the floor. If you try to take the batteries out, you never get it back together again. And you don't want it to cause injury by having pinch points or sharp edges and stuff like that. That's pretty straightforward. So the essential principle 10 for medical devices is medical devices with a measuring function. So we all know about accuracy. That's if something's a metre long and you measure it, it says that's a metre long. Precision is how fine you can break that down. So is it measuring it within 1 millimetre or 1 micrometre? These are standard engineering terms that apply to everywhere. You all know that. And then there's stability. So that's how long it stays without drifting off measurement. And then there's an interesting one, which is the display, and everything should be in Australian legal units. So we're all pretty au fait with medicine here, aren't we, and engineering. So who can name me some of, and I quote some of, the Australian legal units for measuring pressure that we see in medicine? What do we measure blood pressure in? Millimetres of mercury. What do we measure ventilator pressures in? Centimetres of water. In Australia, that's, yeah. You can measure them it's not pascals, it's something pascals, and that's close to centimetres of water, but it's not centimetres of water. Hectopascals, yeah, something like that, HPA. You know, it's 98% correct, but it's not exactly accurate. And they'll use them interchangeably, but they're actually totally different units. So clinically, we use centimetres of water. The pressure measurement units is something I give my students, is to find out how many different pressure measurement units they've been exposed to in the hospital. And if they don't come back with a list of about 10, they haven't been doing their job, right? And there's lots of them. And, you know, are they all legal units? Well, you know, that becomes a grey point. Is a centimetre of water a legal unit? Well, there's no one to say it isn't. And you know why centimetres of water are used for respiratory measurements? Because if you want to generate a centimetre of water pressure to inflate your lungs, all you do is you get a tube blowing air into your lungs with another tube teed off the end of it, and then as far as you put that tube under the water, like 1 centimetre of water under the top of the water, then that creates 1 centimetre of water pressure. You put it 2 centimetres under, you get 2 centimetres of water pressure, 3 centimetres water pressure, and if the pressure's more than that, then it bubbles out the bottom. Real simple stuff. All right? Yes? Well, yeah, I think yes, and the Americans, they use inches of water, okay, just to complicate things. In theory it is. So if you're measuring distance in Australia, an inch isn't a legal unit anymore, right? So if I've got a height measure, I can't sell it and say that you're, whatever, 6'2" tall. I've got to say that you're 187 centimetres tall. That's now the legal definition. Problem is, legal people haven't got into the difference between hectopascals and centimetres of water. So, and if they could ever standardise on a pressure unit, I'd be amazed. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, a millimetre of mercury is exactly how much pressure you need to lift a millimetre of mercury up an open column, right? In those sphygmomanometers, and I think I might, the old ones that they used to have with the mercury that goes up and down, the blood pressure machines. For transport, you screw on the top, right, to stop the mercury leaking out. By the way, it's illegal to sell mercury ones of those or mercury thermometers anymore in Australia, except to some very specific healthcare professions for the mercury sphygmomanometers, all right, because of the dangers associated with mercury. But what people did was they pick these things up and they throw them in their bag and they carry around. So the young players, they'd screw the top on the sphygmomanometer closed, which sealed the tube, and that had the effect of you had to compress the gas above the mercury column to get the right measurement. So suddenly everybody's got, no one's hypertensive anymore, they've all got normal blood pressures, and geez, those drugs must be working, and I thought we had a problem, and I've seen that plenty of times as well. I won't go too much into the protection against radiation because that's regulated by our PANZA above and beyond. That's the Australian Radiation and Nuclear Science Protection Authority, and you need licences and things and stuff to muck around with radiation, whether you give it or service it or develop it or do research with it. And the TGA knows that there's lots of stuff with radiation in medicine, so they just say that you've got to minimise it, you've got to control the level of radiation, you've got to minimise unintended radiation, so the radiation's got to go where you want it to go and not all over the place. There's got to be good operating instructions for using this stuff. Radiation also includes lasers, so I've been a radiation safety officer and a laser safety officer many times, and I keep trying to get out of it, and I'm not one officially at the moment. Radiation safety officer is actually a legal position under the law in New South Wales. But trying to get surgeons to read the operating instructions for a laser, which, might be that thick before they go into the operating theatre, pretty difficult to do. They know where the on-off key is and where the power button is, but, after that. But protection against radiation, it just goes on forever. There's lots of stuff in there. But here's one. So this is basically the last essential element that's relating to standards. And this is medical devices connected to or equipped with an energy source. Now, these can be programmable things. All your software is a medical device. Did you know that? If you wanted to use it as a therapeutic good. So if you want to use it in the treatment or diagnosis of a patient, then it's a therapeutic good. It's pretty hard to work out if someone gives me a program that their software complies with all the essential principles, because, even if you do have the source code which you're supposed to divulge, it's like trying to debug someone else's fairly sophisticated program, and you really can't do that. So it's always been difficult. The FDA legislated so that as of the 1st of July this year, up until that time, software in the United States was not regulated, right? So they could write whatever they liked in software. And all of you with your smartphones have all been developing medical device apps, haven't we? Left, right and centre. So up until the 1st of July, that was fine. You could develop a medical device app all day long, sell it from the App Store or Apple Store, depending on your flavour, what you like. And you weren't breaking the law in the United States, and that's what everybody cared about because that was the big market. And if you want to make lots of money, you put it on Apple Store or pay Apple a bit, or you put it on Android Store and make all the money yourself. So there's 50,000 applications out there on how to lose weight or whatever, As of the 1st of July, they're all now deemed medical devices and they've all got to be regulated. And it'll be interesting to see how far and wide that goes and what it does to the medical device app industry, because it was definitely booming because everybody's buying stuff. Things you've got to worry about is whether they've got internal or external power supplies, whether the things used for monitoring patients, EMF, that's electromagnetic interference, really, electromagnetic field testing. So not medical devices have to be immune to electromagnetic fields. So if I put a high transmission source next to them, like a mobile phone, or mobile phones aren't too bad, but a walkie-talkie or a radar or something like that, does that interfere with the medical devices? And there's very strict standards for electromagnetic immunity, as well as the amount of electromagnetic radiation they give out that can interfere with other stuff. So if you want to really specialise in high-end electrical engineering and power spectrum analysis and harmonics and interference and shielding and all of that, EMF in medical devices is pretty much, you know, it's go for it, it's huge. I mean, you've got to worry about electrocution, and Alistair had asked me to talk about electrical safety today, but I'm not going to go there. But you've got to basically realise that there's two sorts of electrocution. There's macro electrocution, which we're all used to, where you get zapped when you touch a faulty power point or something, may or may not kill you. And then there's micro electrocution, and micro electrocution is very small AC current going into your heart that causes your heart to fibrillate, and you effectively have a heart attack and die. And 10 microamps at 50 hertz will do that. So 10 microamps is imperceptible. 10 milliamps at 50 hertz will kill you. One of the first things I often do is ask students how much I deliberately make this an oblique question, but I say, how much electricity will it take to kill you? So you soon work out whether people know the difference between volts and amps and frequency and impedance. I mean, if they, you know. So it's about 10 milliamps or less. 5 milliamps at 50 hertz will kill you through macro electrocution, which is tetany and respiratory collapse and failure. And 10 microamps will kill you if it's close enough to your heart or touching your myocardium at 50 hertz. So that's things where you've got catheters going into the heart, pacing leads, external pacing leads. The surgeon's touching a piece of equipment and touches your heart, you can get 10 microamps going across the impedance in the surgeon. So, yep. And then there's mechanical risks. So entrapment, vibration, noise, anything mechanical, falling over. There's standards got to do with the tippability of stuff and all of that. Angles which you can see the screen, you know, it goes on. Oh, I think I got that wrong there. 13 was clinical evidence. There's one there that's, the last one's information supplied by the manufacturer. I must have missed one out, sorry, my fault. But the last thing is you've got to have the identification of the device. So each medical device has to have a model number, okay? A manufacturer and a model number might be, maybe 15 might be in vitro. No, sorry, 15 is in vitro diagnostic. Just let me check that. They keep adding them on. Yeah, I'm right. 15 is in vitro diagnostic. That's why I haven't got it there. I'm right. All the numbers are right. When I said in vitro diagnostic before, I think I said that was the 14th one. So it's the 15th one. Information supplied by the manufacturer. You've got to have the identification of the device. So can someone name me a medical device out there that they know of in the market? Can you name me a medical device that you know of out there in the market? Well, a bit more than that. That, you know, like a trade name or a model. A what? Ear popper. An ear popper. Yeah, I know. When they suck them out or whatever. Okay, ear poppers. Okay, so you'll go and buy Alistair's ear popper, right? But if you actually look at that, they don't classify ear popper as a good enough identification. So it'll be Alistair's, this device was manufactured by Alistair's manufacturing company, and the model number is 567893/B/1. So that's the model. The model isn't the ear popper. The names that they give stuff is not what they use to identify it. So most biomedical engineering is model-centric, so everything's by the model. So it'll be the model of the hip implant, it'll be the model of the pacemaker, it'll be the model of the patient ventilator. A ResMed S9, okay? S9 is the latest ResMed biphasic ventilator that you can buy. And that's, everybody calls it the S9, but it's actually got some totally different model number, which is what everybody wants to know about it on. Okay? After that, each individual device has to be identified, right? So there has to be a unique identifier, like the serial number. Now this is becoming bigger than Ben-Hur, and one of the global things that they're just started to talk about now is that why don't we scrap manufacturer, why don't we scrap model number, why don't we scrap serial number, and why don't we just have a unique identifier for every medical device in the world, right? So you'll end up with one, and I think they're going to do it with those little square barcode things that they've got, and they're working out how they can do that and get all that information into one thing. And if you think about that, that's huge, you know. So good luck to them. There's probably consultants making millions of dollars and half their career and travelling all around the world just talking about it, and maybe nothing will happen, maybe it will. It's interesting, to comply in Australia, all the manufacturer's information has to be in English. You're allowed to supply it in any other language you want, you know, under the sun, Burmese if you want, but if it's not in English, we forget it. It's got to be appropriate. They have things on the size of print, so you can't squash it all up and have little stuff. It's all got to be big size, you know, so that someone who isn't blind can normally read it quite easily, okay? They have issues to do with colours, so if you call something red, then there's a range of things that, you know, that's what they'll call red, and if it's this colour, it's purple or maroon. That's not red, you know, that's pink or purple. So you've got to, you know, if you name it, you've got to. And then there's all sorts of instructions. There's user instructions, and you know, it's the old rule: when all else fails, read the manual. So, and that's the take-home message. Actually, if you go into a hospital, if you can't work something, read the manual. But most new stuff will have nurses or clinical trainers that come in to teach the staff to use it, and most nurses and doctors very rarely read the user's manual until they've got a problem. And then there's maintenance and technical manuals and how to fix it and all, and they've also got to be submitted as to the TGA for assessment, and if they don't think your technical and maintenance manuals are any good, you know, you won't get your device approved to put on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. So one of the big problems I have, because I work with a bunch of technicians, where I work there's 2 engineers and 14 technicians. Basically the difference between technicians and engineers is technicians don't like doing paperwork. Neither do engineers, but we just get stuck with it, right? So trying to get them to write users and maintenance manuals for stuff that we develop is impossible. And it's something that's heavily assessed. So it's one of my banes of my life is trying to write proper technical stuff. So the 14th thing that you need to show evidence is clinical evidence, and this is a way where you go and trial it in patients. And this is where it starts to get interesting. I've got my new box. It's got 2 wires coming out of it, 9-volt battery inside, a little switch on the side, and a LED light that flashes. We've all built one of those. We all want to go and stick it on patients and use it. So if you want to do clinical evidence and gather that now, the requirements for doing clinical trials legally are getting more and more and more and more and more and more onerous. Back in the old days, this didn't matter, you know. And back in the old days, you'd go and stick it on a patient anyway, and if it worked, and if it didn't, it didn't. I don't know how much statistics anybody's ever done in this room. They do statistics. So who knows what N is in statistics? Basically, who knows what statistical power is? Statistical power is how many patients you have to enrol in a trial to get a significant result, right? Given how much difference you think you're going to experience between your measurements or whatever. What's N for a surgeon? N for a surgeon is 1. It either works and it saved his life, or it didn't and he's dead. So if you're developing a surgical thing, you get 1 go. Surgeon will try it. Yes, it worked. I love it. I'll have more. It's fine. It's great. Or yes, I used it and it didn't work. I never want to see it again. There's none of this, let's try it in 30 surgical patients. I'm being a bit facetious here, but it's basically how it works in practice. You know, they're not going to trial it in 100 patients, a new bone screw, and trial the old one in 100 patients and then do their statistical analysis to see their rates of fracture. They put that bone screw in and it works, beautiful. They put that bone screw in and it pulls out or breaks your bone, it's no good, right? But to do clinical evidence for other devices is expensive, and they've got things called Hospital Research Ethics Committees, HRECs, and under New South Wales law, all your clinical research has to go through an HREC, and the standard HREC application form is now 90 pages long. Okay, so we've developed all our stuff, and we've got a little box with the wires, and we've done our clinical evidence, and it works, and you live for 1,000 years. So you're up to presenting at the TGA and you do all your things. So they do 2 things. They look at your quality systems for around your manufacturing. Are you making it all very nicely? Or is it being made, you know, in someone's garage? And then they look at the essential elements which I've described. If you can have a certified quality system that meets the TGA's requirements for manufacturing, and you can demonstrate compliance with essential elements, and the easiest way to demonstrate compliance with the essential elements is to show that you conform with the standards surrounding those elements, the Australian or international standards surrounding those elements. You can do that. You don't have to do that. If you can show compliance with the essential elements by some other means, and people do this because there may not be a standard, or they invent their own way of testing and showing that it doesn't compromise health or safety or whatever, or that it's designed correctly, then you can do that. There's nothing to stop you to do that. You don't have to show conformity with any standard to meet the essential elements if you do it correctly, in theory. Never seen anybody do that, but you could. And the 2 quality systems you need to know about are ISO 9001, which is the basic manufacturing one, and most engineers would know about that once they get out into practice, regardless of what field you're in. And then for medical device manufacture, it's 13485. And the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods can be found. Are we internet? Yeah? Wow, that's good. Oh, well, it didn't. Was it going to do it? Maybe sorry, I can't see that from here. Anyway, oh no, I've got it. I'll just try it again, okay? No, it keeps going that one. Yep. So I'd advise you all to go and look at this website, the Australian Government Department of Health and Ageing Therapeutic Goods Administration. And this is it's scary stuff, but if you haven't been and played around this website as a biomedical engineer in your moments of total boredom and madness, you know, you've got to go into here. So I talked about the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, describes all of that, and it tells you all the stuff in real time that's listed on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. Okay? Very, very interesting stuff if you're a biomedical engineer in a hospital. So it talks about industry. So let's say we're industry, we're not consumers, we're the industry at the moment. So if I go into industry, yeah, let's do that. Sorry. So there it's got regulation basics, all right? And then it's got medicines, over-the-counter medicines, complementary medicines, that's a new thing they've got into. Medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. Okay, they also regulate blood and tissues and biologicals. They measure, I don't know what other therapeutic goods are, well, I don't know, there's things there, and then they talk about manufacturing. So you guys need to go into medical devices section and play around in that. And everything's free that you can get to on that. You can print it all off and download it and bind it up. And then there's manufacturing therapeutic goods. So, no, they won't have the Australian standards, right? And they won't have international standards. And although they do give some examples of standards that you should show conformity to meet the essential principles, that is not an exhaustive list, okay? So that's part of the trick to it, is when you're going through the essential principles, then you have to go and search all the worldwide standards, which isn't that hard to do on standards databases, to see which ones apply to the device that you're developing. Okay. Standards are becoming harder and harder to get for free, okay? We used to have a thing in New South Wales Health where New South Wales Health had a standard licence, and every Australian standard, you could go onto their website, put the secret number in and download it and print it off. We've just lost that this year, okay? And we now have to buy them all, one by one. That didn't, other standards printers like IEC and ISO, no, you always had to pay for them because they're international, okay? So, sorry? They've got a new Australian standard called AS3551, which they've been drafting for a long time. I think that's called Technical Management Programs for Medical Devices. Australia, and that's how you manage stuff in a hospital. So how you acceptance test it to show that it complies with the Therapeutic Goods Act, how you safety and performance test it and manage it to show that you comply with manufacturers' recommendations, or if you can't do that, how you risk manage it, how you dispose of it, how you keep records. That's what that's about. The guys that are rewriting those standards are guys that want to be consultants in that field, so that's why they're rewriting the standards. It's a little bit of a self-serving industry, all that standards stuff, all right? I've sat on a few standards committees and I'm a consultant, so I can say that. It's very much a manufacturing industry. They're constantly rewriting the one for installations into hospitals, electrical installations, to the point where it's become so convoluted and intertwined and not nice, clean standards, it contradicts itself, so that people like HPM and Clipsal can sell more gear because they sit on the standards committee. So what you'll need when you're doing all of this, because you won't get all of this when you won't have, there are exemptions to the Therapeutic Goods Act. So how can you trial a device that you're developing if it's not on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods? You need to get a clinical trial notification number or a clinical trial exemption number off the Therapeutic Goods Administration, CTN, CTX. These cost about $250, and usually the organisation that you still need to go through an ethics committee somewhere, but you'll get that, $250. So we develop prototype devices, and when that's good, we might make 50 prototypes, and then we go and trial them against, in 300 or 400 patients. The same device might get used 5 times. I'm not thinking about implants, I'm thinking about little boxes and monitors, and against the pre-existing device to see if it's any better. We do them under clinical trial notification number, where you're basically trialling, a better device against an existing one. And so you're allowed to do that as long as you notify them. If there's any adverse events with your device, you've got to tell them. CTX is if you're inventing something totally new, like I'm inventing the machine to make me live for 1,000 years, and I want to go and trial that. They'd say you need a clinical trial exemption because it's totally brand new, costs a bit more. If you're a medical doctor, you can get what's known as special access scheme. So say I want to use my device that makes you live to 1,000 years old in Alistair because I think he needs it and he's going to be wise when he gets to be 1,000 years old, I can go and get an SAS scheme thing just for you to say that I can use this device in you. Okay, and that's actually prescriber a bit independent, so you know you can have that, right? Then the other way you can do it is that you can become an authorised prescriber. So the authorised prescriber thing is, doctor goes, I want this device that makes you all live to 1,000 years old because I think it'd be really good for every student in Sydney Uni to have it because they'll be really great in 1,000 years and solve all the world's problems, but I need to give this to more than one person. Then he will get authorised prescriber status in his own right. And he can do that. There's all indemnity and legal issues and insurance issues, but he'll get that. But he can't then say to his partner, you can then prescribe that. That's a personal thing. Okay? There is one little loophole in the whole gig which they're trying to tighten up at the moment, and that's what's known as custom devices. So you can manufacture and make a custom device under the Therapeutic Goods Act and use it in patients without breaking the Therapeutic Goods Act. And there are two sort of definitions of a custom device. So something like an orthotic splint where you go along to the orthotist and he makes the splint, or adaptive seating where you go along and they mould the seat to fit your body because you've got something wrong, or say one of those braces that they put on the outside of your leg to hold your leg straight, but you go along and the orthotist or whatever bends it and shapes it and puts it on your foot and off you go. And there's more examples, can't think of too many. They're a pre-existing product that's made to be modified for each person, and that's known as a custom device. Those devices you have to put on the ARTG, and they it's one thing, but then it's modified to suit the individual. That's a custom device. The other custom device, and you need to be careful about this, but it's a loophole we use from time to time, and we do need to do it in specific patients where we do have a real clinical need and nothing suits. So a physician can come up to us and say, I want you to build me this for that patient to treat his condition, and that's the little out that we've got where we can go off into the lab and pull out our soldering irons and start inventing stuff and make it and put it on the patient. Be careful on this one, but it's still an out. But you need a doctor and your patient needs to be sick and they've got to have some problem that there's nothing that they can use currently, and you've got to have a doctor specifically ask you to make something to try and treat that for that patient. So thank you all, those who stayed with me and didn't go to sleep and left. So students, yes, it's a pretty heavy regulatory pathway. It's better to know about the jungle before you enter the jungle because you can navigate your way through and get out the other side. It's a lot better than getting into the middle of the jungle and not realising that there's pathways or things. Okay? So thanks. And are there any questions? Sorry? Intravenous devices? Depends how long they're supposed to be implanted. No, in vitro diagnostic devices are classified as IVDs. They're separate. They're a separate little thing because they're new and they're trying to work that out. Things that you stick in you, like catheters and needles and syringes and vascular access devices, they all vary between class 2A, class 2B and 3, depending on what they've got in them, how long they're supposed to be implanted into you and how long they last. And that's why I say you need to, if you want to do something, you need to go and read the classification rules because they're a bit like the rules to Mahjong, you know, they're pretty complicated and but it does describe it quite well, and to try and lecture on it, you know, I don't have to say, look, go and read this burst. And even I couldn't lecture on it off the top of my head. You know? All the international standards will apply to all EU-governed countries, right? So, you know, to show electrical safety and compliance with the essential principle for